Morning, everybody. As you've been told, I'm Phillip Newton, and I've been an elected board member of the TBA for 6 years, and have been increasingly impressed at their remit and their achievement. If the industry didn't have the TBA, it would have to invent it, and that I'm a great believer in the movement that we have and the opportunity that we have. I'm going to give you a snapshot of the second economic impact study. It's a snapshot because the final report isn't fully published yet, and it actually runs to, I think, probably over 100 pages. And so if you've got until 4 o'clock this afternoon, I could do the full Monty. But I'm going to give you a snapshot. Firstly, a bit of background. 5 years ago, under the chairmanship of Richard Lancaster then, we started discussing the importance of getting a fact and database for the industry. There was a huge amount of guesswork involved in the thoroughbred breeding industry. All of us had our opinions, all of us thought that we were right, but we didn't actually have a fact base to develop from. And that we commissioned PwC, and it's a really big deal for the TBA to do this, because it cost a significant amount of money. And that the first report was delivered 4 years ago. It was absolutely essential for everything that we then set in strategic terms for our future. It gave us a fact base, it gave us a database, and we were able to talk to all interested bodies, government, all influences, with a clear factual knowledge. We began discussing 18 months ago whether we should revisit this, and of course we should revisit it, and we had to revisit it because this second report is even more important because it gives us an opportunity to look at some trends, to look what happened 4 years ago and what's happening now. And I have to tell you that there are certain things that are happening now that are alarming, and that we have to set a course to ensure that we find the right way forward for this, and that we're not going to have the most receptive of audiences sometimes, and that will become clear, I hope, as I go through the presentation. So we've got a world-class industry, no doubt about that at all, and I'm talking about the racing industry. I'm not talking about the breeding industry on its own, I'm talking about the racing industry. We've got 3 billion of contribution to UK GDP. That's hugely important, that's proper industry, proper grown-up industry, and £500 million of that actually comes from the breeding industry. We've got the highest proportion of world-class thoroughbreds, pro rata to all other racing jurisdictions. We provide about 23% of world-class thoroughbreds. We got 24 of the world's top 100 races, and if you think that that isn't as impressive as it sounds, if you look at all of the jurisdictions now, we really are punching above our weight for an island of our size. The industry overall creates 100,000 jobs. Hugely important, yep, at the moment, we've got full employment. But what our industry, the racing industry, provides is an opportunity for growth. This is an industry that is growing, can grow, will grow, and we've a product that we can sell around the world. There are 3,318 breeders in Great Britain. And we've got about 9,000 active broodmares. 10,000 jobs in the breeding industry alone. And then you need to add to that another 9,000 that support the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all of the ancillary trades that support the breeding establishments. So that's impressive, but it's not all of the story. A world-class industry, absolutely undoubtedly. We're key to the UK economy. We're a really important opportunity for them in terms of tax revenue, and a world-class product. And that, apologies, but I came from a corporate background, and that if I offend anybody by calling horses product, then please forgive me. We're a significant employer. It's another tick, and that with the way that technology is developing, that will become even more important as the years roll by. Capital intensive, absolutely. That's one of the big problems with our industry. And do we get attractive returns on capital for the breeding industry? Well, let's have a look at that. Now, that's an alarming slide if you just look at it, but it's actually not, because it's good news that we've got businesses that work and supply and provide and create and contribute to the racing industry that are doing so well. And that we should look at them with admiration, because they absolutely are there to promote, increase and drive the revenue for our industry. But it's frightening to look at the bottom. Breeding gets a return of about 2% on capital employed, and that takes into account the very successful breeders, the ones that really make the money. At the other end of the scale, it's a different thing. And that although it's not on there, if you actually slide down and you put owners at the bottom there, owners will be in huge negative territory. And that it is odd that the people that supply the product and the people that use the product are right at the bottom of the food chain. So let's drill down a bit into some alarming facts. In 2014, 45% of breeders surveyed were unprofitable. Half then, nearly. Bad news. Where do you think it is now? 2/3 now. 66% of breeders' surveys are unprofitable. We talked 4 years ago of trying to create a robust and sustainable industry, and that must be our goal, but it's a long, long way off. 353, 8% of breeders left the industry in the last 5 years. That's a considerable amount. I'll come on to what they produce and why it's important shortly, but for 8% of your population to disappear in 4 years, it's a trend that most economists would find alarming. If you breed National Hunt and you sell a National Hunt filly, chances are you'll probably lose 12 grand at any National Hunt sale. If you breed for Book 3, or you have a yearling that's selected for Book 3, the average loss is 23,500 quid. It's bad news all the way around. A third of all GB foals produced are by breeders within 1 to 2 mares. So that's 30% of the production line, 33% of the production line of 4,500. It's 4,778, I think, foals that were born last year. A third of those all come from small breeders. And if we're losing them, operational gearing kicks in, and that there is a domino effect on the whole of the industry. Stud farms are being sold to alternative uses. I talked, and this is anecdotal, but I talked to 2 agents, and that only one of them said once in the last 5 years that they'd sold stud farms to continue as stud farms. Julia. So not only is the product unprofitable, not only are the breeders leaving the game, but the factories are falling down as well. We've also got a major labour problem. 25% of all stud farms, and that you can extend that to the whole of the racing industry, have skills gaps. We can't find the people to do the job, and that we've got to overcome that. The TBA takes training as a prime responsibility, but we can only provide so much. Now, they're really worrying trends. But there's a contradiction coming in terms, and this is why I said earlier about not being able to get receptive ears for everything that we're saying. What I've presented to you so far suggests and is an industry that has a seismic fault in it. But yet, what do? In the last 4 years, the foal crops have increased. France by 4%, 5%, 8% in the UK, and that the majority of that has been taken up by medium to larger breeding entities, and 25% of that in Ireland. Now, I'm going to say something that shouldn't be ascribed to TBA, but the Irish have an opportunity in our marketplace. They have a huge market which they are dependent upon to introduce and to sell their product. They have a vested interest in supporting and ensuring that the structure of British racing is sound, and that I am not sure that they take their responsibility as seriously as they should do. Unfortunately, and trends will show you this, that the Irish thoroughbred industry very quickly gears up in production terms, and that what's it going to do? It's going to flood our market because it's going to come across here. And that is why one of my advocacies will be for the British bred premium scheme that Bryan is going to present to you shortly, and that Julian's alluded to. It is time now to remember that charity begins at home. So breeding remains chronically unprofitable for the vast majority of breeders. Many small to medium-sized breeders are facing extinction if the return on investment doesn't improve. Now, that's not me being an alarmist. That's not me looking for sensational headlines. Surely the facts that you've seen there are indisputable. We're losing the production line, we're losing the producers, and that even when they do it, they're losing money. You can't argue with it. There's a polarisation too that's taking place, which is unhealthy, between small and large breeders. It's showcased by the opportunity in the sales ring. If you've got something in book 1, the average profit is 118 grand. Book 3 is 23.5 grand. And that if you think of how slim book 1 is in comparison to book 3, you'll recognise the extent and size of the problem that we've got to deal with. Brexit's another crack in the wall. We have no idea what the final outcome's going to be. Yes, we all hope. Yes, we all think it's going to be all right on the night. Yes, we absolutely will work hard. And that the TBA picked up the Brexit mantle absolutely early, employed an economic consultant, and that went to war with it, and that they galvanised the industry. And what I can say with my experience of other industries is that the racing industry is better placed than most. We have a plan, we're prepared, and we're going in the right direction. But you all read your papers in the last week and 10 days. You know what's been happening in Parliament. Do we trust them? Probably. Should we? Probably not. So Brexit's a huge issue. Now, some facts about the racing industry. You need 20,000 individual runners every year to sustain the current racing programme. And that it is important because we've got a deal going, we're increasing our funding, and that that is what the gambling industry requires, a programme of the size that we have. 50% of everything that runs is British bred. The remainder comes from external markets. And I said this 4 years ago, and I'll say it again now. Any industry that relies on overseas market to the dependency that we do is fragile. If the number of small breeders of any size continue to disappear, there's going to be problems. I learned early on, I got taken behind a wall and taught about it, a thing called operational gearing, that you make an extra £1,000 in a year in sales, and that you make £1. You lose £1,000 in sales, and you lose 5,000 quid. And that if we start to lose small breeders, we lost 8%, so let's say that's 8%, and just because it's easy for my maths, 10% of the foal crop, so we lost 478 horses. There's a huge knock-on effect to the racing programme. So don't underestimate the need to have the right level of production. And that, again, you know, it goes against what I was saying earlier about the Irish market providing, and it also goes against the fact that we're increasing our foal crop. They're always there, and so everybody's going to say it's all right on the night. It's not going to be all right on the night in 10 years' time. I assure you there is a seismic crack developing in this industry. There's another issue too that we don't take into account. At the July sales, there were 30 countries that were buying UK-made racing product. The forecast in the economic impact study is that that market will only grow and continue to develop at 8% a year. Now, there's another problem for the racing population. We have developing countries over the world that see the opportunity for racing industries. So they buy ready-made product, they take it away from ours, and that suddenly this world-class industry that we've got with all of the infrastructure that we have is under pressure because we don't have enough product. Now, I am not advocating overproduction. Please do not run away with that idea. What we have to do is create a robust and sustainable breeding industry that can provide the product that the racing industry needs. We also need to be more aware that charity begins at home. So what I'm creating, and that Andrew used Joni Mitchell's You Don't Know What It's Like Till You've Gone, and I was a little less imaginative. I wish I'd been so, but this is a perfect storm. We've got an ageing demographic. We're losing breeders because of age, and we're losing breeders because of capital, and I'll show you something in a minute. Higher property prices and limited wage growth. If Grandad and Grandma have got a small stud farm and they've been breeding for years because their dad and mum left them a few quid, and mum and dad have been able to get by, if they've got 8 grandchildren or 4 grandchildren, what do you think the money's going to go on? Do you think the money is going to go on, we've got to get their education done? Do you think that the money is going to go on, we've got to get them on the property ladder? Look at this. Average number of years required to save a deposit has increased by 84% over the last 10 years. You may think that I'm away with the fairies, but it's relevant. The cash that goes into our smaller breeders inevitably comes from spare cash that they want to invest as hobby farming. They lose money doing it, but they've been very happy to do it. But there are now other demands for their cash, and that we mustn't underestimate that. And though it comes back to the fact of this creation of a robust and sustainable industry. Reduced profitability or no profitability. I've told you that, and you can see that the vast majority of breeders are unprofitable, and actually you don't need me to tell you that because you know how difficult it is. But now, differently from 4 years ago, we're starting to see the medium-sized commercial operators starting to struggle. That's what the EIS is telling us. And in 4 years' time, I suspect it will confirm that again. We're getting operators exiting the business. 8% already. I told you that we're losing the factories. And a negative outcome, as far as Brexit is concerned, could force us to have an even more radical approach. The supply line is absolutely key to the racing business. We 45–50% we supply. We absolutely have to protect that and find a way to protect it, to encourage it, to grow it. It's a hugely important industry. We're the supply line, we're right at the bottom of it. It's not a sob story, it's a fact. And that what we have to do at the TBA now is to decide how best we present this report. Because, as I said to you, because of the increase in foal numbers, everybody's going to say, oh, it'll be all right on the night. It's always been all right. You know, it was all right 20 years ago. Oh, you're just alarmist. We're not. So it'll end up in a diminished product. You all know that key to racing finances are 8 runners a race. We're on the cusp at the moment, averaging. Just look at your field sizes. You lose 478 foals, and that they disappear out of the landscape. And suddenly, maybe we're hovering about 7.9, 8.2, that sort of touch. And it's no good because we need 8 runners a race. The racecourses need it. The bookmakers pay out on that. And whether we like it or not, we've got the circumstances that we have. I am not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow. I'm not saying it's going to happen next week. But the trends are there. And if we don't look at them and if we don't start to address them now, there will be long-term problems that cannot be corrected down the road. I think this industry has huge potential, but we need to be collectively focused on this. I always say when you join the racing industry, in any part of it, you're given a welcome pack that includes a T-shirt that says self-interest rules okay. And it does. We can't afford that now. We all have to be together. So, I'm going to re-emphasise to you what Julian said. I came into this industry thinking that the reintroduction of breeders' prizes, or came into the TBA rather, because I've been owner breeding for 40, 50 years, that breeders' prizes were the way forward. They are politically unacceptable. They will not happen under any circumstances, and it's no good us wishing that they would happen. If anybody on this board here could make them happen, there'd be a reality before you walked out this room. The only way to rebuild this industry collectively is through prize money. The only way to rebuild this industry is to ensure that we get charity beginning at home and that we have a recognition that British bred should be supported. There are real opportunities out there, but there are some huge, huge hurdles to overcome. I want the industry to go forward. I want the industry, and it's a legacy. We need to pass this on, and we need to pass it on in a better condition than we've been given it. I hope you'll be excited by what Bryan's going to present to you. He's been an absolute pillar of strength. He was behind the MOPS architecture, and that he's with a lot of discussion with Julian and with the remainder of the board put together. This is a TBA initiative. It's not perfect, but it's a start and it's somewhere to go. Bryan.
So the key question is, if those are the problems, what can we do about it? We don't claim to have all the answers, but since we're on song titles, I'll quote Bob Dylan, "The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind." And I believe we've found at least one of the very important answers that will make a difference, and that's what I want to talk to you about. At the moment, there is precisely one scheme in this country that favours British breeding, and that's so-called MOPS, who most of you who are flat breeders may not know about. How many have heard of MOPS here, please? Yeah, one that's not a flat. It stands for it's a national MOPS, it stands for the Mare Owner's Price Scheme, and basically it costs less than 1% of levy income, but it's the only scheme targeted at British-bred horses. And it's targeted at what is probably the most long-suffering minority of British-bred horses, fillies produced for national hunt racing. It provides prizes to the owners and connections, significant prizes, if those horses win one of a large number of races. So £5,000 or 10,000 prizes, which are highly significant in the context of national hunt racing. Now that is beginning, as Julian said, to change behaviour significantly. National hunt trainers who previously didn't want mares in their yards are increasingly looking to buy them. Owners are looking to purchase them. And breeders are looking to put horses into training when they didn't before. If I can speak personally, 5 years ago, any horse that I bred, any filler that I bred, and I was going to put that on later actually, yeah. Any filler that I bred would go to race in France for the obvious reason that there was a better chance not to lose money by racing them in France. Because of MOPS, any filler that I test now is raced in this country, and 3 of them will be racing this year with partners that are attracted by MOPS prizes. If it's changing my behaviour, if it's changing the behaviour of other trainers, it will change the industry bit by bit. MOPS is absolutely nothing compared with the scheme that I'm about to talk about, which is a British-bred premium scheme designed to address at least some of the fundamental problems that the EIS has identified or that the EIS has confirmed. We do have serious problems, and this is one of, to me, the key answers that will help us solve the problems. So firstly, it's aimed to provide significant incentives solely for British-bred horses or side-by stallions sending in this country. The charity begins at home is true. We're not talking of restricting races to British-bred horses, which would be wrong. We're not talking of putting most of the levy board money to British-bred horses. We're just talking about taking an increased percentage of levy board money to incentivise people to race horses bred in this country. What that should do is to encourage increased demand at sales for people to buy the horses that we all produce. Clearly, if it's an ugly-looking horse compared with a wonderful one by Galileo, you're not going to get someone to buy it instead of that. But if all things are equal, if this horse is pretty similar to that one, this horse is eligible for significant premiums, and this horse isn't, it could well tilt someone to buy your horse rather than someone else's, or to put in an extra bid or two. It should also encourage increased participation by breeders as owner breeders in the way that I've described that MOPS already is. And perhaps it may encourage some of the owners that have good fillies to become breeders themselves and help the TBA and the breeding industry to grow. Equally importantly, as well as promoting British bred, we have to support a key objective of the TBA that it has long held, that we must provide incentives to maintain the diversity of the racing programme. So we have to provide incentives for people to race middle distance horses and stayers on the flat, to breed jumps horses, and in particular to provide incentives to increase the appeal of fillies and mares on both flat and national hunt. So we're not just targeting incentives at British bred horses, we're targeting behaviour that will encourage people to maintain the diversity which is vital to the entire breeding industry and the racing programme. Okay, I'll now talk about the principles of the scheme rather than its details. Just one comment that the chairman made. He said we had the basis of a plan. Actually, I think he was being a little bit diffident in that. We actually have a very detailed plan to the extent that we have a white paper. And the white paper has detailed proposals for how the scheme could work, detailed costings, and lists of options about how the scheme might be modified, might be improved. And that white paper has got to go to the key funding authorities. The other day we presented it to the Horsemen's Group, and Phillip Friedman was very helpful in allowing us to do that, and we had what I think was a good reception. We have to get approval from the BHA, and again, we had a very good meeting with the BHA, no commitments, but very positive in understanding the problems and understanding how this will address them. And we've got to get support from the Racing Authority and the Levy Board. I do feel that our white paper has got rather more chance of traction with the people we need to persuade than the white paper produced by Theresa May at Chequers last week will have with the people with whom she's got to negotiate. I hope I'm not being optimistic in saying that. First principle of the scheme is one that I, and I think everyone here on the board would prefer not to have, is that it requires nomination payments as for plus 10. We started off by saying, could we have a scheme that doesn't require nomination payments? The problem with that is that if you don't have nomination payments, it is very difficult to produce the size of prizes that really will make a difference and persuade people to behave differently than they were before. The bulk of the funding will come from the Levy Board, but it's important that some of the funding comes from breeders and from owners so that there's an element of self-help. And without going into the details, it makes the whole scheme much more affordable and much more ambitious if we have that than if we didn't. However, the good news is that there will be substantially higher prizes in this scheme than have ever been offered in plus 10 and have ever been offered in MOPS. So if the proposals that we've put are accepted, most of the prizes won for horses winning flat races in the scheme will be £20,000, not 10. Most of the prizes won by national hunt mares in the scheme will be £15,000. The prizes won by national hunt geldings in the scheme will be £10,000. Those prizes, we believe, are big enough to make a difference. The other factor which should satisfy breeders is that up to 20% of those prizes will go to breeders if they're the people nominating the horses as foals and yearlings. So the breeders have a chance to make a profit on this. We're not saying it's a huge one because largely it's self-funded, but if you're a good breeder, you will be successful. If a horse you bred wins a £20,000 prize on the flat and you nominated it, you get £4,000. You can call that a breeder's prize or you can call it betting on your own horses, but it's still an element of the scheme that I think is important to motivate breeders to participate. Next, it is equally important as increasing the prizes that there is a much bigger range of races which will be eligible for prizes in this scheme than has happened in plus 10, which is the one with which probably most of you are familiar. So there are many more races open to 3-year-olds. There are many more races open to horses winning over 1.25 miles and beyond. So that the tilt, there is a serious tilt from what happens in plus 10 where most of the prizes are won by short distance 2-year-olds. In this scheme, there will be a much bigger balance across the whole racing programme so that there is much more equanimity in terms of who wins what. And finally, and again I think this is a very important point, there is no limit to the number of prizes that can be won. Like Phillip, I've worked in retail for much of my career, and I know that hope is a very big factor in motivating behaviour. And the thought that you might win 5 prizes worth £100,000 could well motivate someone, whereas I very much doubt that the thought that you could win 1 prize worth £10,000 is going to make very much difference when you're putting your hand up at an auction and deciding to spend £20,000 a year on training fees. So the fact is that this scheme offers more prizes, it offers bigger prizes, it offers rewards to breeders, and the prizes are not limited by 1 each. You can win as many as your horse is capable of. So the implications of the scheme. First significant implication, and why we have to do a lot of work in persuading the funding bodies, is that it's going to cost a lot of money. Now, I've said that part of it is being funded by nominations paid for by breeders and owners, but that is less than 30% of the total in the scheme. The rest has to come from levy funds, and ultimately, these are funds that could have been spent on normal prize money. So our proposal is that by targeting these funds in a specific way to favour British-bred horses, it will produce a disproportionate effect on the prospects for British breeding. That's what I believe, it's what the board believes, and I hope that you all believe that. One of the reasons why it should produce that effect is that every year, once the scheme reaches steady state, so basically in 2 or 3 years for the flat, when every horse nominated to this scheme has reached the age of 3, in rather longer period for National Hunt when every horse nominated to the scheme is winning races over fences. When it reaches steady state, it will provide £7.75 million worth of bonuses each year that are not available to horses not in the scheme. So they are horses that either weren't eligible for the scheme because they weren't British bred in any sense, or they weren't entered for the scheme. That's 7.75 million reasons why this scheme should encourage people to breed British, buy British. In providing those prizes, I've said before, it creates widespread opportunities for horses suited to all distances and all disciplines. And in particular, it provides incentives for flat and National Hunt fillies, which in both codes are the most disadvantaged section of the population we produce. We hope, given the necessary approval, to introduce this scheme next year, so that basically we would take nominations for this scheme in 2019. But the good news is that if you have a horse already nominated to plus 10 or already nominated to MOPS, and that horse is eligible for this scheme, then the new improved prizes will apply straight away. So you would get larger prizes if you have a British bred horse by a British stallion nominated to this scheme than if it were an Irish bred horse by an Irish stallion, immediately. And the same applies with mares under National Hunt. So the scheme should come in quickly. It should start to produce larger returns to breeders and owners quickly, and it should start to change the behaviour, which is the key thing, very soon after that. So I hope that this fairly quick run-through has indicated to you that at least this is one of the key answers that we've come up with to try and improve the situation for British breeders, which Phillip explained so clearly is a dire situation. It is a major initiative focused on promoting British breeding. It is an initiative pushed by the TBA, which continues its work for trying to help breeders in this country and trying to help breeding production in this country, and I very much hope that all of you will support it. Thank you.